Hi, it's Dustin Lanier. Thanks for listening. Please find me on LinkedIn for original public sector operations content every week. And please reach out to me if I and my team of procurement professionals at Civic Initiatives can help you be a public procurement change agent. Well, good morning, Chris. Thanks for jumping in. We were just talking about you're pulling the yeoman's run here by jumping on from, where are you this morning?
Oh, I'm back in the States. I'm back in Tampa, Florida, but I flew in from Berlin, Germany yesterday. And so as you mentioned, I was dragging a little bit this morning, just adjusting to the time differences as we all have to do.
Well, thanks for jumping on. And I've had a lot of people indicate interest in this topic. So, and you guys are definitely, in my regard, the preeminent expert on this. So, let's just start with some introductions. Yeah. Tell us about the Hackett Group and tell us about you, and then we'll step into some discussion.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll start with me and just who I am and how I fit into the whole Hackett Group here. And, if you look at the Hackett Group, and I'll say a little bit about who we are as a company, Hackett is a business advisory firm. We've been around for 30 years, and we are well known for a lot of the work that we do from an intellectual property standpoint, whether that be research, whether that be benchmarking of functional performance, and a lot of the focus that we have is on organizations. We like to say it's the G&A infrastructure of these organizations. So that would include areas like procurement, the top of our conversation today, but it also includes areas of finance, information technology, human resources, shared services. And these are all areas that we study as a firm. And, in doing that, we engage with organizations in all of these areas in a number of different ways. And one of the ways that we engage with organizations in this is through bringing visibility to their current performance. And we do that through benchmarking. We've been doing this for so long, so it gives us the opportunity to really have a significant database of insights from many, many different organizations. As organizations look at that and they say, well, how well am I performing? I know I need to do some improvement to my organization. And where do I get started? And so we're brought in to help provide those insights to them, not only in terms of how they're performing, but how they're performing versus other organizations, so against peers of theirs, et cetera. And in many ways, if they don't know where they need to focus, this helps provide that. Some organizations come to us and they say, well, this is where we think we need to go focus. And we say, well, I don't know. Let's take a look at a benchmark and let's see how you're doing. In many ways, it's like doing a medical exam. You're going out and you're looking at your performance and you're looking against that, versus other organizations. And in some ways, what we find is some organizations say, well, we thought that this is where we need to be focusing. And what we learned from the benchmark that may be an opportunity, but where we ought to be spending our time is in this area differently. So it not only exposes gaps in performance versus other organizations, it also helps to prioritize where you ought to be focusing as well. Now, one of the questions you asked is, what is my role in this at Hackett? My role at Hackett, and having been at the firm for, over 2 decades, so I've been here for quite some time. I lead what we call our global sourcing, procurement, supply management advisory practice here at the firm. And so what does that mean? I lead a team of advisors that reside within the United States, advisors that live and reside in Europe, as well as a team that resides in some of our other offices, and specifically our office down in Hyderabad, India. And out of that office, we do a lot of quantitative analysis, looking at the performance of organizations and, not just collecting and providing those insights to organizations, but also using a lot of this benchmarking information to drive our research, to really look at some of the trends that organizations focus on over the years and what they should be focusing on. What are some of the things that we're seeing that is occurring over years when we look at a larger population of organizations in procurement, in supply management, and beyond? So that's the role. We advise hundreds and hundreds of organizations, globally. And I think, some of the conversations, Justin, that you and I have been having is, why this and why you and I and, why Hackett and Civic initiatives. And a lot of it is that, we've dipped our toe in the water in the public sector. Much of the reputation that we built globally, around, the areas of procurement and other areas as well, has been more in the, what I would call the private sector. And not that we haven't participated in the public sector. We've done, work with state governments, federal governments, universities, local, but it's in a much smaller scale than what we have. And so, one of the things that you and I have talked about is the opportunity to bring this together, to bring some of those insights that we have in the private sector and start to compare and bring that into the public sector as well.
Excellent. Let's talk about the span of what kind of insights that you guys have in terms of the number of times you've done those kind of benchmark studies. I don't need to get into the exact number today, but just what's the span of the number of entities that you've done things for, and how many that you've done? And then do you have a variety of characteristics inside of that? Is it big firms, large firms, public, et cetera? So how do you kind of make sure that your database is able to kind of pull and pluck things for people at different sizes and different shapes?
Yeah, it's a lot packed into the question you just asked. So let me give you, just an idea of the scope first in terms of the size and in the breadth of, the benchmarks that we have done of organizations over time. I made a comment earlier that we've been doing this, for around 30 years, not only in procurement, but the other functional areas as well. And over that span of time, you could imagine that we've engaged and, measured and brought insights and benchmarked quite a few organizations. It numbers in the thousands on a global basis. And so it's a lot of different organizations. We've done thousands, tens of thousands of benchmarks of organizations over time. And, what we're talking about is what I call our functional benchmarks. It's sort of like going to the doctor. I always use this analogy. People talk about, well, you know what? I go to the doctor, I go to have an exam on an annual basis, get my annual checkup. And some people will go and get a much more exhaustive exam. They may go to a place like the Mayo Clinic, which is well known for doing these exhaustive exams where you may spend days being diagnosed and going through a whole battery of tests. I'd like to say that the benchmarking that we do, because it's quite involved, is more like that Mayo Clinic type of exam. It's deep, it's detailed. It takes time. It takes effort on an organization to go through this. And, there's a lot of ways that you can look at your performance in, short ways, continuing with that doctor analogy. You may go back to a doctor and say, well, we're going to look at your temperature. We're going to look at your blood pressure. And, we may do a few other things. And based on that, hey, your blood pressure is within range. The benchmark being, I think it's like 120/80, and you're within that range. And so you're in benchmark. And so, benchmarks aren't unique to business. I mean, we use them in our personal lives all the time as we compare. Benchmarks become, if you're into sports and you're a runner, I'm a runner, I'm a swimmer, not as much anymore. I'm not competing, but there was benchmarks, there's records that you were trying to, compare your performance against, or even just the performance that you had in the past. And so these benchmarks are formed, in a lot of the things that we do in our personal lives, from health to sports, et cetera, but also in business. And that's really what we're trying to do, is bring that, kind of yardstick. And I think, as you look at that, it's important to understand. I mean, I made a comment that 30 years ago, we have been doing these benchmarks and started doing them. If you look at the performance of organizations today, the benchmarks that we utilized and were utilizing back, say, 30 years ago are no longer relevant. Performance continues to change. And that's why you continuously have to refresh the data that you're bringing into the benchmark, because performance is continuing to improve. Organizations aren't marking time. They're improving what they do. Why? Because they want to be more competitive. They want to be more cost effective in what they're doing. They want to be more, bring more value to the organizations that they're part of. And benchmarking is one way to expose those areas where they can go do it. And so when you look at our database, it is large if you look at it over this longer period of time. But today, we're not using the data that we collected back 30 years ago. We may use that for research and look at how things have trended and how things have improved, over a period of time. What we're doing is we have this ongoing database, in procurement, in supply management, where we're just continuing to refresh that database. And as data comes in, we're taking out the old data and continue to refresh it with the new data that of companies that are coming into that database. So it's continuously being refreshed. It's not a point in time, it's an ongoing benchmark. And so what we have is the opportunity at any given time to compare organizations to the most recent data set that we have in our database. We also use that data in terms of developing research and providing guidance to organizations as well.
So I wrote an article yesterday talking about how when Civic has historically done benchmarking exercises, we try to tie it to guiding principles because we feel like there's a natural tendency sometimes that an organization, maybe they aren't doing any benchmarking and then they overload themselves with benchmarking. And so then the thing kind of falls in on itself because people don't know why we're measuring certain things. So, Civic, from having done a lot of general assessment reviews, tends to look at the guiding principle conversation about efficiency, quality, and stewardship. So efficiency, the ability to move things along so that agencies can meet their missions, quality, getting good outcomes while we're doing it, and then stewardship, recognizing that these are public dollars and we need to treat them in a particular way since they're different than private dollars. And so then we have Civic has historically, identified certain specific kind of benchmarks that associate with being able to say, where are we against these kind of guiding principles? So, when we have reviewed your, the kind of benchmarks that you guys do, it's interesting like that there is a lot of mapping on that. And so, that's why we've been excited to talk with you about a particular framework here. So, let me wrap that statement into a question. How do you advise clients how to pick the right amount of benchmarking? Like not overwhelming their organization, but having enough to go deep. Like, how do you help them with that conversation about like what's actually important to measure and how do you hit the priorities versus maybe some of the tangential ones just so the organization doesn't get overwhelmed? What is your experience in those kind of decision-making processes?
Well, I think I'll go back to the analogy I provided around going to a doctor. A lot of times, we'll go once a year and they'll do some tests. They'll do as I mentioned, the blood pressure, they'll check your temperature, they'll check a few different things. And, maybe they'll even do some blood work. They'll just do an initial blood work, do a CBC and just check, sort of the normal levels. And unless there's gaps that they find or things that are, not necessarily normal in doing that, they typically don't go any further. And so in some ways you can look at the benchmark and your question was, how do you not overwhelm an organization? If it's sort of like the checkup that you're doing, I think you start, keep it at a high level and say, if I'm a procurement organization, one of the things that I might be looking at is, my delivery of value to the organization. Savings, for example, it's one of the most common measures that procurement organizations look at because their enterprises are saying, are we getting best value for the relationships that we have with suppliers in the marketplace for our organization, for our customers, for the people that we serve, et cetera. And so one way to determine that is, do benchmarking. And then you can do that and say, yes, we are. And as long as we are, then you say, you know what, we're probably doing a pretty decent job. Now, sometimes and sit there and say, well, those things aren't necessarily aligned. I'm not, the speed by which we're doing things, the cost that is, it's costing us to do certain things. The value that we're creating is not necessarily aligned. And it seems to be trailing what we see others in the marketplace doing at a high level. And so that may warrant a deeper dive. For example, if you're not saving to the level that others are doing, the question becomes, well, why is that? What is causing that? And so this is where the sort of, cause effect kind of relationship in benchmarks come into play. Because a lot of times you'll look at a benchmark, and I use the term output performance measures. Savings, for example, spend cost savings that a procurement organization may generate is what I consider to be an output performance measure. It's not an activity. Now, there are activities that we do that drive those savings higher, but that activity, the savings is not an activity in and of itself. It just tells you how well you're doing. So then the question becomes is, why is that? If my savings aren't to the level of other peers of mine, why is that happening? Well, it could be that you don't have enough people sourcing. You're not going to market enough times, comparatively versus others. You may not be using the same type of technology that others are using. An example of some technology some organizations use are auctions. They may use electronic auctions in actually going out and creating more transparency in the marketplace to drive and generate higher degrees of savings for the organization because they create a lot more competition. So these may be some of the practices that you find out that those organizations that have higher savings, they're doing these types of things. So one of the things that we want to uncover in the benchmarks is understanding what are the practices. One of the things that we have the opportunity to do is really look at who are the top performers. And as part of that, we use a term called digital world-class or world-class performers. And these are organizations not dependent on industry, et cetera. They just perform very well. They are much more efficient. They are much more effective than everybody else. And one of the things that we do in our research as we're collecting all of this information is to understand why. If we have a population of organizations that from an output performance, they deliver more value, they do it in a much more cost-effective way, then what are they doing different than everybody else? And those things that they do different, you can highlight those as practices. So, to your point going forward, do I need to go through a full and get all of this data? Sometimes that's required. Many times an organization will say, I have a new leader coming in, a new head of procurement. And that leader just says, you know what? I don't know what's been done. I just want to get a good understanding of the performance of my organization. And so they may highlight the fact that they want to do a benchmark, a comprehensive benchmark, to get a full understanding as to where they are. You may have another leader who's been going through a lot of transformation in the organization, making a lot of change. They say, hey, you know what? I've been doing all of this. Let's see how we compare. I know we've improved internally, but how are we improving, versus the external world, the peers that are out there? Because even if you're performing and improving your performance by 5% per year, if the rest of the world is improving by 10%, then you're getting done. And the only way to bring that visibility is to have that external perspective included in what you're actually doing.
Let's dig down one layer. We'll put you on the spotlight. I'll start with one that you just said, like how many solicitation events should I be doing? And, that's kind of a corollary to probably the number one question that we get when we are in these kind of things, which is, how many purchasing agents do I need to have based on the amount of spend, or how much should a buyer or a purchasing agent be able to be expected to do in a period of time? And you sort of, you referenced that indirectly just then, right? Which is, do I even have enough people sourcing? And it's a very common question because a lot of times procurement officers, they may feel intuitively that they should have more people. Of course, more people on a situation where the process is broken doesn't necessarily solve the problem. So, any conversation about new people has to come with the question of, do we have a process that is set up to actually allow for throughput? But putting that aside for a second, assuming that the governance will allow throughput, how have you seen clients try to determine how many people should I have? Like what can benchmarking do to help answer a question that is based on math and not based on intuition?
Yeah. It's a great question. And I would say that when organizations benchmark with Hackett, one of the key questions they ask. And, sometimes it's driven based on the economic cycle that we're in. And, with the current economic cycle, the focus on cost, the focus on margins within organizations, there's a lot of focus on the costs. It's a little bit more difficult economic cycle right now. And we don't know exactly where this is all going to play out over the next 6 months or so. But, what organizations are looking at is, do I have the right investments in place? And when you think about a supply management or procurement organization, there are several areas that you invest in that organization to provide services, to create a capability as an organization. One of those is labor. It's the number of people that you have, performing all of the activities that a sourcing or procurement organization, conduct as an organization. Some organizations use third parties. They may outsource a piece. That's not as, common within the private sector, but more common within the public sector. And so that becomes an investment as well. They may invest in technology and say, we're not going to do this all manually. We're going to use technology to help us do this more effectively. And there's lots of different technology solutions. We've certainly seen an acceleration in, what we call digital transformation or the utilization of digital technologies within the environment. So there are a number of different areas that make up the overall investment and cost of that function. But the biggest piece is the labor itself, at least today. That may change, and it continues to change. We see and have seen over time is that more reliance on technology than on labor. We call it sort of the labor for technology swap that we see within organizations. That organizations, as they continue to evolve their organizations over time, there's more swapping out of labor for technology investments. And so you're seeing this drive to a much more efficient organization in terms of its dependency on the labor itself. And in some cases, it just frees up that labor to do other types of activities. So if I look at my organization, and I was a leader of a procurement organization, I said, well, let me take a look at that overall organization and see, if I look at the overall number of folks in it, is the number of folks that I have performing procurement activity, at a level that it should be at. And the first thing you want to do is to understand that what drives, much of the number of folks that you have is the amount of spend that you have as an organization. So an organization may say, well, our organization has, 1 billion in third-party spend with suppliers. And so the question then you ask is, well, how many people do you have in procurement to do all of that procurement activity to engage with that $1 billion worth of spend? Some organizations will say I have 10 billion. Others will say I have $500 million. Some will say I have 100 million. So what you want to do is make sure you normalize that. And what Hackett does is we normalize based on $1 billion of spend. So an organization may have 2 billion. But if we split that in half, so what is your number of FTEs, full-time equivalents? You can look at that as staff that help you support that overall $1 billion in spend. By doing that, that gives us the ability to normalize our data to compare it against other organizations. The other thing that we're doing is not just normalizing the data to $1 billion of spend, we're also looking at it by industry. And so we will look at it overall, but we'll also look at, other organizations that are more similar to you. Either it could be your industry, it could be the complexity of your organization, it could be the fact that I'm in the private sector and we have a lot of regulations that we have to deal with, et cetera. And these things cause, effort, which drives up. And so if you have some of those things that are, that are typical of your industry that you can't control, then that's where we want to form a peer group around to compare that and compare you against those. So I'm going to go a little bit further because I want to help you understand that. Let's say I go out, like going to the doctor, and the doctor says, we looked at your weight for your size, your height and age, et cetera, and you're a bit heavier than what we would look at as sort of a benchmark for your height, et cetera. Same thing with the benchmark. We go out and we might come back to you and say, what we normally see are 50 FTEs or staff doing this set of procurement activity. Because what we want to do, one of the things is just also normalize that we're comparing apples to apples, that the organizations that we're comparing against are doing the same amount of activity. If there are activities that other organizations are doing that you're not doing, then we want to remove that from the comparators. We also want to do is like, if there are activities that you're doing that we don't consider to be a procurement activity, we want to remove it from your numbers. So we want to ensure we have this apples to apples comparisons between organizations. So that's one of the things that we do. And once we see that, and if you are, if we see the normal organization or a peer group or a world-class organizations, having 50, but you're at 70, the question then says, all right, overall, it seems that I have 20 more people engaging in the same set of activity, the same amount of spend as other peers of mine. So why is that? So the first thing we want to do is that if you're 20 over in columns all of procurement, one of the ways that we do our benchmark is we're collecting data at a process by process basis. There may be activity that's considered to be PO processing activity. There may be activity that is a go-to-market activity where you're going out to the supply market to do RFXs. You're asking for a request for proposal or a request for quote from these organizations. These are just some of the activities that you might be involved in. Other organizations may be involved in mitigating risk within their overall supply base as well. But these are all those activities. And so the next thing we want to do is, because we're collecting the data at a process by process basis, we can look at it overall, but we can also understand, here are other organizations in terms of those 50 FTEs, how many are allocated to doing sourcing execution, going to market, doing an RFX, an RFP or an RFQ with a population. How many of those are allocated to that type of work versus doing PO processing versus trying to mitigate risk, et cetera. And so we can look at that level. So you may be 20 over, but when we look at it on a process by process basis, what we might find is that you're actually in line in all of these processes with the exception of sourcing execution. There, you're much higher than everybody else. So once we diagnose and we understand where that is occurring, the next question becomes, why is it? Why am I have so many more people in sourcing execution, going to market, doing RFPs and RFQs, et cetera, versus everybody else? And that's when we start to explore. We start looking at some of the things, Dustin, you were saying before. What is my productivity? Am I technology enabled? Maybe what I see in those other organizations there in that particular process, they have much more technology involved. And so they're much more productive as an organization. So what we do is we continue to peel back the onion to isolate what is causing that overall gap that we're seeing at a higher level. And that's really the purpose of the benchmark, is to really help to isolate where those gaps exist. And not only that, if you were to fix them, what kind of opportunity might you create for your organization?
And I think that the reason that we've been discussing and putting touches on a framework to extend is that when Civic does assessments, we do it with people who are full-time employees who have been previously been public procurement entities. And so if we understand where there's gaps or maybe shapes or deficiencies, then being able to dig in, are we having to follow a governance process that nobody remembers why we're doing that? It was for somebody 2 generations ago, and we continue to do it because we think that's the way, what the job is. Or somebody should go communicate with the political leadership that this particular type of review is redundant for a review that's happening over there, and it's adding no value, but it's creating time. So the benchmark can potentially point to and articulate a reason for change. For example, if the issue is poorly shaped governance or poorly timed governance, the only way to make that retreat is with not by saying, I don't want to do that anymore, but I want to say yes to something that's more important, whether that's supply chain resilience or achieving our vendor goals or any number of things. And so math is very helpful to move things that are stubborn to move, which is, I think, an exciting opportunity.
Yeah. And I think you a great point, because, sometimes it's very difficult for organizations to move forward. Maybe they see that there's opportunities. And, you use the term, and organizations use the term business case. How do I create a business case for change? And, benchmarks can certainly provide a lot of the data in a quantifiable way to help with creating those business cases for change. And, because a lot of times when we create a business case, it's because we want to make an investment. And today, a lot of those investments have been in terms of technology platforms. And so as enterprises, as organizations evaluate, I have an opportunity here in procurement to invest in a technology platform. Maybe it's an e-procurement solution versus investing something in another part of the organization. I have to make decisions. I only have so much capital to allocate to these various different areas. And so procurement has to be able to create that business case to highlight, not only, what is the cost going to be, but what is the impact? And if I was to improve, to a certain level, what kind of impact might that have on our enterprise? And that's where benchmarks can really help. If I was to get to this digital world-class performance, I understand that I will do these types of things, but let me look at how they are performing. What value are they creating for the organizations? Mm-hmm. And so it becomes a very good way to help support these business cases that we have to put together to make the investments within our enterprises to continue to improve them, to drive the kind of, the value that our enterprises want out of them. And so it really helps to support those types of questions that we should be getting when we ask for, these types of investments.
So I have one more kind of use case opportunity question, and then let me ask a look forward question. I'll say I talk about this stuff a lot. You actually taught me something new a second ago when you were talking about reverse auctions, because I'm very aware of reverse auctions, of course. Mm-hmm. I've always thought of them as a particular way to go to market for a particular space, but I hadn't really ever considered them as a way to do more sourcing events, which I'll have to rethink my opinion on all that based on that comment. I mentioned one comment that we get a lot, which is how many people should I have? The other comment that is pretty ubiquitous almost anytime that we're in a shop is how long should this take? How long should an RFP take? How long should a P card transaction take? How long should a reverse auction take? How long should a 3 phone call bid take? Sort of inherently tied to the question about how many people I have is what should the throughput of the office be based on the people that I have? And if the way that we're going to market, you commonly hear people walk in and say, oh, I don't want to do an RFP because in my organization, it takes 2 years to do an RFP. Mm-hmm. Well, why does it take 2 years to do an RFP? Is it because we haven't trained the end user on how to sufficiently create a requirement elicitation activity and actually give us the requirements? Yeah. Is it that we have strangled ourselves with governance on the ability to actually release an RFP? Is it that we're putting out RFPs that are so convoluted that we get drowned in question and answer periods and we have to pull them back? Are we having protests because we didn't go to market with a good document? There's a lot of things that can fall into the how long things should take. So how can benchmarking help not necessarily solve the problem to your diagnosis point you made a couple of times, but actually help people say on the common channels through which we can do work, what is a good way to say this should take the X? And so therefore, if it's not taking X, we're not necessarily going to get there tomorrow, but these are the areas we ought to do more sourcing events through this channel, or we need to fix that channel or whatever. So the how long should something take is probably the second most common question that we get when we're in assessments.
Yeah. And we use the term, how long it should take as a cycle time. And you can look at cycle times in regards to what I would consider to be more transactional processes. Once you actually have the ability to move forward, with a particular supplier, I mean, there's a process around creating a PO and, putting that out and, to them that, here's our agreement that, we're going to go through, and then they, go through that whole process. And there's a cycle time to doing that whole PO processing activity. And so we measure those types of activities. You mentioned going to market. going out, doing an event, soliciting the market, for a particular area, for a particular need that the organization has. And, that takes time. So one of the things that you want to do is say, hey, we go out to market. We know our costs may be higher. Maybe it's the fact that, we're just not delivering a lot of value. So there may be things that are giving you a suspicion that maybe there are underlying challenges or issues within our organization that is causing these higher level gaps in terms of how we're performing versus other organizations. It could be in savings, other areas. But one of the things is cycle time. So cycle time is an indicator of how productive. If your cycle times are shorter, you can do more in a particular year than if they are longer. If a cycle time is 100 days to go out to market to source something, to actually go and do the RFP, the RFQ, et cetera, it's 100 days. If I was to reduce that to 50 days, I ought to be able to do twice as many events in a year. Or, the other indication is I can have half the number of people doing it than I had before. And maybe with the other folks, I reallocate them and to do other activities that we may not be spending a lot of time on today. Maybe you're not spending a lot of time on risk management as an organization, or on things that have to do with social responsibility of the organization, the diversification of your supply base, the sustainability of your supply base. These all require effort. And in many cases, we're not getting additional people. I mentioned earlier that, we're in a more economically challenging period of time. And so with that, how do I become more productive? And so when you look at sourcing cycle times, we do look at the number of days. We're actually looking at it in business days. And so when you look at, just to give you some numbers on an overall basis, when you look at the best performing, what we consider to be the digital world-class organizations, they're actually going out, just a typical, right? And typical is a very broad and, term, 45 days to go through and source a particular area versus the peer group, which is non-digital world-class organizations, which is like 54 days. So you see a gap there, roughly 25% improvement. And so the question always becomes is, well, if I look at these digital world-class organizations, they're saving more money. They're doing it in a much more efficient basis. They get less people driving more value. How are they doing it? And they also have cycle times. That's one of the indicators. They say, well, they're faster. Their cycle times are shorter. And then the question below that is, well, how are they doing it in such a quicker way? And Dustin, you mentioned a whole lot of different types of things that could be causing that. It could be the fact that, there's a lot of approvals. Maybe there's just too many approvals that are necessary. And that's going to vary between private and public organizations. In the private sector, there's a lot more flexibility in terms of the approvals that you can go through, which may not be the case in the public sector. It could be the lack of technology to do this, where it's very manual. It could be the fact that the way that we're going to market is, from a speed standpoint, maybe there's, it's not only the technology, but, maybe we're not, exposing the market to, or going out to all of the various areas. Maybe we're not leveraging the suppliers that we have because we don't have, already, and we're not necessarily, we're going to market in cases that we don't need to go to market. Maybe we have a one size fits all, that every time we go to market, we use the same technique. A lot of times in the private sector, and again, I know there are constraints in the public sector, but there are things to say, well, what's the level of risk in a particular area? If the risk is low, do we have to go through all of the same evaluation criteria as we do if the risk is very high? The answer is no. So the idea of creating sourcing processes that are much more fit for function or fit for purpose becomes an opportunity for a lot of these organizations to reduce those cycle times, to reduce the amount of effort, and to ultimately drive higher productivity and higher value to the organization.
Well, exactly. And, coming back again to some of the value that Civic, I think, can bring in some of these conversations is, we have folks who've done a lot of different kinds of procurement events, and we really value and emphasize having a lot of tools in the toolkit. So when you're looking at those kind of cycle times, like one of my kind of cliche stories is around doing more category management is, if we're doing 100 catering phone calls a quarter and it's to the 4 same companies, why can't we create a master contract? Why can't we think about doing a task order style solicitation? And sometimes procurement shops just simply haven't had exposure to all the tools in the toolkit, or they haven't felt strategically enabled to go use some of the tools in the toolkit to do different kinds of things. Let me ask a forward question, and in doing so, maybe kind of reflect a little bit on the vibrancy of your database. Civic has, we're fortunate to have clients across the country, large and small, and benchmarking comes up a lot. And so, we have sought to establish a logical repeating framework with you, because I think in addition to leveraging the data that you may already have, if we can assemble a good set of public sector clients who want to do benchmarking, we can add to and extend your database. So the ability to say, here's the benchmarking that exists today, and let's really have a solid for-purpose public sector framework. So I assume every time that you guys do a benchmark, you're adding to and you're seeking to learn and you're seeking to evolve the way that the database works. And the methodology that you have is transcendent across a lot of the opportunities. If we were to say, let's extend this framework to really, further add and extend the value that the Hackett data set already has with a new refreshed set of public sector information, like how that adds value to every person that comes after that.
Well, it's like anything, you're continuing to your point. I mean, you're always adding to that. So you're gaining additional insights. And in this case, data is the insights that continues to grow. We're in a very interesting period of time. And I think one of the things that, a lot of folks are investigating are some of the new technologies that require data. And I'm going to use this as a bit of an analogy to what we're talking about here. One of the hyped up areas and very focused, I don't want to use the term too much hype, because I do believe it's very real, is the whole focus on generative AI and just AI in and of itself. AI and the fuel to allow generative AI to work really well is the data that it has access to. And so anything that we do going forward, and what we're finding is that we're understanding that data is really the fuel for a lot of the things that we want to go do. And it can have a big impact on our organization. So companies today are saying, well, if I want to do these types of things, I got to have access to more data. And I'm going to use that as an analogy and come back to the benchmarking. One of the comments you said is that as organizations continue to participate in it, the database grows. And that's something that we've learned over many, many years, 30, plus years in doing benchmarking, that asset, that database becomes very, very valuable. I mentioned that, older data may not be something that we're using for comparisons today because we continue to refresh the data, but it's certainly valuable to look at trends and what has happened and how things have progressed over a longer period of time. And so this database continues to grow, and anybody that participates in some of the efforts and accesses that data will continue to get more and more. That data just becomes more and more valuable over time, and so I think there's a lot of very interesting things that we can go do as this data continues to grow and leverages the framework that we have. Not only is it going to be very valuable in the exercises, the assessments, and some of the projects that you're doing with your clients and the organizations that engage in that, but at the same time, there are opportunities to start to understand some of the practices from all of these organizations. And I think, there's always those opportunities that, you and I, Justin, may continue to have these discussions as we look at, more and more data, talk about what have we been finding. You could imagine a year from now, you and I spending some time together to say, all right, we have all of this. We've collected a lot of data from different organizations. What are we seeing? What are some of the unique, and things that we're seeing across all of these private sector organizations that we can share in venues like this and other, ways with all of those organizations. So I think there's a lot of, not only helping in the specific initiatives and projects that you may be doing, but also, creating some broader insights in terms of what we are seeing more broadly across private sector. And even some of the differences. I could even see us exploring some of the differences that we're seeing between public and private organizations as well.
And honestly, I think you need both, because having been asked about benchmarking and how do we actually accomplish it and where is the source of truth, you can anticipate you're going to see both sides of the coin of the conversation. So one is, I want to compare myself against peers. That comes up a lot. The other is, I want to compare myself to private sector, because that comes up a lot, because people say, I want to be best of best, and it doesn't matter who I'm comparing to, but I'd like to compare to a medium sized or here. And with the breadth that you guys have and the methodology that you've built, I think there's a great opportunity to answer both of those questions with a full throat, which is the ability to compare to global digital best leaders is available. The ability to down select and to focus on public sector, the ability to work a common project with multiple people in public sector in order to generate new and refresh information. All of those things are possible within the methodology and the data set that that Hackett built over decades.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as you look at public, private, you highlighted it, I highlighted it, that I think there's a lot of opportunities to really learn from the two in terms of the application in other areas. It's always interesting, when we work with organizations. I have organizations that will come to us in the private sector that will say, I only want to be compared against those in my industry, and I want to see how well we're doing. And, in many ways, what they're looking at is more of I don't want to call it a competitive analysis, but they look at that and say, I want to look at it. I want to ensure that I'm, doing well versus my competitors, et cetera. I have other organizations that come to us and their leaders, and they say, I don't want to be compared to anybody in my sector, in my industry. And the reason is that they, sometimes I get the comment that, they don't believe that their industry is very good. And they said, I want to be compared against the best of any industry, because I'm not going to learn from my industry. What I want to learn are, what are the folks doing in other industries that may be more progressive, more mature than what we are. And I want to learn from what they're doing, and I want to be compared through that lens versus the other lens within my industry or within my sector. So, you certainly have different objectives that organizations have. I think the opportunity here is that we can solve for all of those. If you want to be compared within your industry, we can do that. If you want to be compared against the best performing, what we consider to be the digital world-class organizations, we can do that. If you want to be compared outside of your industry and just more broadly, we can do that as well. And a lot of that's going to be driven based on the objectives of that organization.
Well, Chris, thanks for making time and fighting the jet lag bug. We've already had an opportunity to test this framework with a client recently, where we used Hackett information embedded into one of our assessments. I think there's a lot of great opportunity ahead on creating the glide path on that work and being able to extend it and do some great things together. So I think it's really exciting to be able to hear what Hackett does a little bit more and the opportunity. And then I look forward to continuing to explore that and develop that out with you in the near future.
Absolutely. We are absolutely looking forward to it, Dustin. And, it's, like I said, we're just getting started right now. And I think if we were sitting here, and we'll be sitting here a year from now, 2 years from now, looking back, we're going to have a lot of very interesting insights to have discussions around and share some of our perspectives.
Excellent. Well, great. Well, thanks everybody. This will be on demand here in this video. If you are watching it, you want to share it with somebody, and then I will take this over to the podcast as well and look for more information on this in the future. So thanks again, Chris, and everybody have a great day.
Thank you.